Here's a results section I pulled from a former student's lab report. I've changed the student's name to indicate that this will be a group paper. So up at the top I have 3 fictional students here who have hypothetically written this particular results section. Now this results section is not specifically related to the community ecology lab, but it will still be useful to show how I might expect students to review another group's report. Just for some context, the student who originally wrote this paper had worked with a group to investigate the impact of lighting on best bug burrowing. So they had taken a few best bugs and they had done some light trials and some dark trials, and they timed how long it took the best bugs to burrow. So when you look at the graphs and it talks about the light environment or the dark environment, that's where that information is coming from. Now in lab, before the students actually start working on the results section, I will discuss thoroughly the formatting and content requirements for a results section. By the time students reach their upper level courses, they really do need to have a good understanding of how to write the different sections of a scientific paper, and it's very stringent, so students are also going to get a comprehensive set of guidelines to follow when they're working on this as well. Now, by the time students have heard my discussions in class and they've reviewed the guidelines, they should grasp that the purpose of a results section is to provide results in figure form. You need graphs, maybe some tables, but you definitely need some graphs. Now, in addition to that, a results section should be brief, and the textual information that's included, so the text portion, should be linked to the figures, and it shouldn't provide any type of interpretation. There should not be excessive extraneous information, so discussion, qualitative information, discussion of behavior of individual subjects in the experiment, that type of information should not be included unless it's specifically related to one of the figures or one of the tables that they've included. All right, now, I've logged into this document on 3 separate accounts so that I can pretend as if I were 3 separate students. So I've got my Drew account here, I've got my Gmail account, down here I've got my MSU account, and there's a lot more I could say about this paper. I could provide a lot more comments than I've provided, but I don't expect that students are going to point out absolutely everything wrong with a paper that I might notice. And students, this is really the first time that they're reviewing a results section, at least for some of them, and this may be the first time a lot of them have written a results section, at least at the college level. So I'll probably provide a little bit of leeway in terms of, what they might miss when they're reviewing, but also, when they're actually writing these papers. All right, so students will use an explicit checklist, which I'll show in a minute, and the results section guidelines, as well as the information I discuss in class while they're working to review the different papers. And they should be able to indicate, hopefully, what other groups have done well as some room for improvement, so things that other groups may want to consider changing. I hope that it will be easier for students to notice issues with content and formatting when they're looking at other people's papers rather than just focusing on their own paper, because they're so connected to their own paper they might not notice things that they could have improved. But when they look at other papers and they're going to be looking at a couple of different papers, they may get a better sense for things that stand out in terms of improvements that could be made. All right, so I'm going to show the preliminary version of the checklist. Now this will probably need to be revised to some extent, but here it stands now. I'm not going to go through everything that it says specifically, but students will use this checklist and their results section guidelines as they work on their reviewing process. Now, I've included here the checklist as the first page of the document, and I actually did this in the spring semester when I had students do peer review as well. I had included a rubric and a rating form as the first page of the document. Most students just printed out that rubric and rating form and filled it out by hand, and then I gave it back to the original authors. Doing it electronically, though, provides more immediate feedback, so students can fill this out. They can read through the document, provide their comments, and then they can share it directly with the authors. However, I'm considering alternative formats for this checklist. So as you can see, I have included some questions that reviewers could fill out. So on a scale of 0 to 4, how would you rank the author's data presentation? On a scale of 0 to 5, how would you rank the author's text content? These things they could potentially fill out and they could give directly back to the authors, or I could just have a rating form that is specific for the reviewers. I'm considering maybe using a Google form for this. so that the reviewers can use it kind of as a guide as they're working through their review. But then any information, what they fill out on that form, they have to transfer to comments that they then put on the actual document so that that document can be shared with the authors and the authors see their comments and their thought process as they worked on the review. All right, so those are some things I still need to determine regarding the checklist for students. Now I'll get into some of the comments that I've provided. So I've essentially provided comments that point to issues that are incorrect in addition to, or could be improved in addition to, some positive comments as well. This first group of comments here refers to this first paragraph. Now, what they're indicating in these comments, the hypothetical students, is that this group has included an extensive amount of behavioral information. So they've talked about what individual best bugs were doing during individual trials. And that's really too specific for a results section. So these students have noticed that that's really a little bit too specific. One student mentions clear explanation of qualitative results, but your results section might be more effective if you only focus on the trends your graphs show. Now what's important here is that one student, this second commenter, has actually responded to the comment made by another student up at the top. I'm hoping that students will actually use the comments function for this purpose, and I'm going to encourage them to do this. So this second commenter has provided a suggestion. They have furthered the initial comment. So they mention, if these observations are relevant, maybe you could talk about them in your analysis project. So they're not essentially discounting the information that the original group has provided with regard to behavioral data. They're saying, maybe there's a better place for it. All right, now if we continue down a little bit further, we have another sort of little mini conversation between two students here. This one's dealing with figure formatting. So the first student mentions a positive comment, nice job with your figure formatting. The second person agrees with the comment made by the first student, but mentions that, they noticed something that the first student didn't notice. They mention, maybe you want to change the figure number. This is the first figure that you're presenting in your paper. Maybe instead of figure 4, you want to label it figure 1. All right, now I'm going to skip, I included a couple of other comments, but I'm going to skip all the way to the bottom now and talk about the last set of comments. So what we're looking at here is this final graph. Now this final graph very clearly compares the light trials to the dark trials. So the light trials are red, the dark trials are blue. The two best bugs have not been averaged, but their sample size was so small that averaging really wasn't necessary. They're essentially showing individual variation, which is good. In the future, next fall, I could require that students put error bars on their graph and average all the subjects together. That was not a requirement at the time that this original paper was written. So if we look at this graph, and then we scroll up to look at the other graphs. The other graphs are actually showing the same information, but the same information not consolidated together. So for example, each best bug has its own separate graph, and the light trials are separate from the dark trials. So these last two graphs are showing data from the dark trials. The first two graphs are showing data from the light trials. And the problem with that is that you don't really get an effective visual comparison between the results of the light and the dark trials. This last graph, however, very effectively compares the two different types of trials side by side. So the hypothetical students have noticed that the group has very effectively compared light and dark trials in this final graph. The first person mentions, this graph's really nice. I like how you compare the light and dark trials side by side. The second commenter comments as well on the first comment, mentioning that maybe, I agree, nice job on this graph. Maybe you don't even need the first 4 graphs. Now, importantly, this very last comment down here, this final student, has indicated that she's actually learned something by reading through the comments provided by other classmates. So she mentions that she likes this graph too, and that from reading these other comments, she's actually noticed that her group could improve upon their paper. So this is not her paper that she's commenting on. This is somebody else's paper, and she's noticed from the critiques that her group created way too many graphs and that they could actually consolidate some of that information into a clearer comparison like the graph that's shown on this group's paper. Now, I don't necessarily expect that students are going to use the comments thread for this type of critical comparison or critical discussion, but I will encourage them definitely to use the comments thread to clarify comments provided by others, to agree to the comments provided by others, or maybe disagree to the comments provided by others. And I will encourage them also to indicate when something in the comments has actually helped them. I think really part of the affordance of using Google Drive for this review process, which I didn't really do last spring, is that the students can learn from one another. They're not just comparing their own paper to one other paper. They're looking at a whole bunch of different papers, and they're looking at what the reviewers of those papers are saying as well. And they can interact with the other reviewers to further the discussion. So I'm really hoping that they'll use the comments feature for that purpose, to learn a little bit more about or get a little bit more deeply into the content and the format that's necessary for writing an effective results section of a scientific paper. At least I expect students to provide agreement. So probably a lot of students are going to go on the document and they're going to notice that if somebody else has already reviewed it, maybe that other person has provided all the comments that they wanted to provide. And a lot of students might be like, oh, well, all the comments are already there, and they just close their computer and move on with their life. But instead, they can actually provide some kind of response. Hey, I agree with this comment. And then the original authors will see that 3 people provided the same response. Maybe we really should consider changing this particular aspect of our results section. All right, so this is my preliminary thought about using Google Drive a little bit more effectively this semester for peer review. I do plan to create a video similar to this one for student use. So I'm going to have an example paper like this, example comments, indicating some of the more effective aspects of the example paper, some of the less effective aspects of the paper, so things that can be improved, and also how the students can use the comments function to get a little bit more deeply into the content and structure of writing a results section. So I look forward to actually implementing this in the fall and seeing how it goes, and I hope that with sort of a little video tutorial guide, students will have a better idea of how they can actually go about this review process, and a little bit more about what they can get out of the review process as well.